We are not all attorneys, although there might be some on, although there is not tonight. And everything discussed is just personal opinions and may not stand up in court. Our hope is that we can open these discussions up for a broader audience and have these ideas recorded for the next generation. There are some great high-profile boundary surveyors and some even college students from across the country on this Zoom, and we hope that we can all gain a bit of knowledge from these discussions. And now I got to go find out where chapter 12 is. That's funny.
All right. Pretty sure we did chapter 12. I remember talking about it.
I don't think we covered 12.
I know. I didn't.
Am I off of chapter?
I think you are. I think I have it as only highlighted up to 12.
Okay, well, let's jump over to 12 then.
Yeah, so we had to break part 11 into 2 parts.
Yeah.
But where is, let's see. Where is my part 2? Part 2 is not posted. Huh, okay. Well, I got some cleanup on my side.
Okay, well, that means I just need your help even more because I'm not as prepared for for 12.
Oh my goodness, this is awesome.
Great. That's why, yeah, it's harder to break. Okay, well, let's jump into it then. Original surveys and related platting laws. I guess first off, I'm just going to lean on you guys a little bit more. Let's just go through. Is there anything that stood out to anybody or discuss on this one? Let's just kind of get a discussion list so I'm not skimming through this and trying to play catch up as we go. But those that did prepare for 12, anything you want to talk about?
I was looking for my other files. I'm sorry. Oops, there's Joanne.
Okay, well, we can just start going through the principles. Oh, go ahead, Sean, were you going to say something?
Yeah, about the platting laws, is that like in reference to the public lands system? Is that what we're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, we've got the public land system, and then because those are the original surveys, but you have to keep in mind when we think about original surveys, that's not just the original BLM or GLO plats. You know, we go do a subdivision now, and that then becomes the original survey, at least in that subdivision, right? Those are all platted at the same time. That becomes the original survey for that section or those lots. So this can apply to both instances. Well, let's just jump in. This one's a pretty simple one. We've got 6 principles to kind of go through. Principle number 1, original surveys to create new land parcels are regulated by legislative laws and rules. So when we think about that as far as the original government subdivisions of land, the GLO, those had special instructions that were passed out to the surveyors that were doing those surveys. And it's really interesting to read. There are some materials out there. We talked about this 2 or 3 times ago. There's some materials out there that actually have all those books in like a big binder or packet. The history of the rectangular land system. And then a lot of state societies have published their specific sets of rules that applied. I know when I was working in Iowa, if you go on the Iowa State Surveyor Society's website, you can actually get reproductions, books of all the laws that applied then. That was an interesting state when we tested for licensure because they had 2 or 3 different sets of laws. So depending on the era those original surveys were done, the different laws would apply. And certainly, today we've got the 2009 manual. And then when we look at current original surveys, subdivision plats, those are then regulated by local municipalities, county, and state laws, and there are platting rules that apply to those subdivisions. Principle 2, an original survey does not identify boundaries, it creates them. A monument set by the original surveyor and called for by the conveyance has no error of position. It is legally correct in that only the description may be in error. The title to a junior parcel can be no better than the quality of the title of the parent parcel from which the junior parcel was created. When retracing boundaries of parcels of land, the lines and the corners that were created on the ground control over the lines depicted on the plat and the lines described in the description. And finally, when retracing parcels of land, the priorities of control identified by case law, some statutes, and common law are actual lines run and marked on the ground, natural monuments or boundaries, artificial monuments, adjoiners, bearings and distances, and area. Those are kind of our rules of construction, if you will. So as we kind of scroll through here, any comments, questions on these principles? Anything that stands out, agree with, disagree with, or want to discuss in there?
Quietness. Where is
Several
everybody?
of these,
I'll
several of
jump
these
in.
principles are things we've talked about in the last chapter also.
Yep.
Yep. John, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I'll jump in here for a sec. Yeah, I think what the real point here is that when we're doing original surveys, this law, there are always laws, rules, regulations that govern that survey process. Not necessarily our technical standards and things that we think about, but you've got the subdivision laws, rules, and regulations, and the processes of approval and all that kind of stuff you have to go through. And you've got the federal laws, you've got state laws, and then you've got your local and county issues as well. So you have to kind of think of it as kind of an all-encompassing kind of an impact. But there's always something that you're going to have to consider when you're out there doing that survey. And then primarily original survey. All you're really doing, in every one of the original surveys, is following the instructions given to you by the landowner, and the public manual, the PLS manual of instructions, 2005 manual. That is the government's instruction, the owner of the federal lands instructions to us on how to survey federal land, and so that's what it's there for. Once that land has been passed into private hands through a patent process, now we're following rules and regulations under state law. So we have to be careful to consider what rules of law are we really following. As an example, original surveys under the federal government, if you were to survey patented land, a quarter section, say, and somebody wants to sell the north half of their quarter section, are you going to follow state law or federal law when you do that? Because half by area under state law is different than the instructions under federal statute as to how to survey half of a quarter section, the north half of a quarter section, say. How you determine that east-west 16th line. There are two separate sets of instructions there, and both are if a surveyor goes out and says, well, okay, half of this quarter section measures the whole quarter section, splits it half by area, he's going to come up with the correct solution under state law, where half of that area under federal law is going to be midpoint on either side, and it's not going to be half by area. It's going to be something other than that. If it's the trapezoidal shape of the parcel will at the midpoints won't split it in half area. But so if it's a private landowner selling half of their quarter section, that boundary is in a different place than a boundary a half quarter on a patent under federal law. And we have to be aware that there's two possible solutions here. Then you go out there to retrace the boundary, and that's what you're looking for as well. I find evidence of a fence line. Does it fit any one of those two possible solutions? And if it was a private grant, it should fit the state solution. If it's a public grant, it should fit the federal solution. So we got to be aware of those kinds of things and at least keep them in mind.
Thanks, John.
Yeah.
You know, and the discussion really in this chapter could easily lend to how do, let's see, we have a chat. Sorry, I just popped it up. Okay.
No,
Thanks,
Joanne says, feeling lucky I live in Hawaii.
You say that, but I would be scared to go there and do it. So I'm feeling lucky I live in Utah where it's all square and simple.
Mhm. Mhm.
You know, the discussion in this chapter could very easily go into how are we subdividing this, right? And John said you got to know those rules, and so that discussion can happen. But you know, in context of this book, it's a retracement principle, right? So if we did open up a modern plat, you know, even if it was, you know, we talked about what ancient was, but it was a modern plat in terms of the last 40 years, right? How understanding how that plat was created, how it was mapped out, you know, if you go set up a lot corner, you know, how was that intended to be split, and then looking at, you know, like these principles talked about, does the monuments on the ground, the property corners on the ground match the actual graphical representation, or the written description of that overall property in retracing that. So regulation of original surveys, John just touched on that very well for us. Original boundaries. Once statutory authority is granted to the sovereign or the landowner to create boundaries, and the survey is conducted, the lines that are run on the ground in contemplation to create the boundary line and the corners and any marks made on lines or monuments created become part of the original survey, including the field notes and plats of the parcel. The rules and regulations that are in effect are for the creation of the parcels. Once a boundary line is created, the presumption is that it was created in accordance with the laws and regulations in effect at the time. And then it's accepted by the government body, including the courts, and no subsequent surveyor has authority to recreate those lines. They remain fixed forever. So again, our role is to not interpret what was intended and try and fix something if we think it's an error. Our job is just to simply take the information and retrace it on the ground. We can't change what was done. And if there was error in the placement, overall error in the placement, you know, we take all that evidence together, you know, and we don't say, okay, well, this is all an error, so I'm going to move this person's lot over 5 feet, 10 feet, because that's really what it was meant to be, even though I found certain evidence of that. It is where it is at that point, you know, and those monuments control. Formal pre-surveying practices. I apologize, guys, that I'm reading over this because I was looking at the other chapter. So please jump in and help out and fill in. So we're not just reading through this, but I'm skimming as we go here. The enactment of subdivision laws by federal government to dispose of the public domain. Was an example of the best thinking of the time. These laws contemplated and provided for the public domain, with the federal government creating the macro exterior boundaries and local surveys creating the micro subdivision interior boundaries. One serious flaw that once the land passed into private ownership, federal law had no binding effect on the states as to real property rights. In some states, federal rules for resurveys or retracements have not been adopted. However, most states, by either statute or case law, provide for local surveyors to conduct retracement or to retrace originally created boundaries, as well as boundaries created by state laws. Today, this conflict still causes serious problems. And I like that kind of discussion. I look back to my first few kind of survey conferences when we start talking about this, and I remember the discussion that would always happen between surveyors is someone would get up and say, okay, this is passed into private ownership, so now the public regulations, the BLM manuals don't apply because now it is local jurisdiction, you know, and then, you know, the other half of the group would get up and argue saying, well, no, you know, it was set by these rules and it needs to be applied by that. So I'm going to throw this out to the group just kind of as a point of discussion. As you guys have retraced boundaries and looking at that balance between the original rules, as John was talking about, and the local regulations, how have you resolved that? Do you have any examples of the challenges that you've faced in trying to balance between the two regulations and find which regulation to use? Anyone want to jump in and just kind of talk about how you resolved that?
It is a
Great.
quiet Wednesday night.
Awesome, guys. No. Okay. Well, we'll keep rolling on here. That's fine. That's fine. Maybe we'll actually get through chapter 13 today too. Certain of land location. A monument set by the original surveyor and called for by the conveyance has no error of position. I think it's pretty. Again, this wraps up everything we've been talking about for quite some time here. But the objectives of platting laws with respect to ensuring to future certainty of the location of parcels require the following: a durable monument, unique monuments having certain identification, frequent setting of monuments, accurate measurements, references to the monuments in later writings, and adequate descriptions identifying a sufficient number of the necessary controlling elements. I know some state statutes actually very clearly call out what type of monument should be set, and some just say durable. Just kind of just poll the room here and see what do your guys' states require and what is local practice for setting monuments.
Yes.
Hawaii.
Go ahead.
Hawaii does not have a rule of specific items that you can place on the corner. Generally, you'll do a pipe, or of course on concrete, you'll accordingly mark it. Asphalt, maybe a nail. Usually pipes.
Pipes.
Yeah, in Wisconsin, subdivision regulations give a specific monument size and weight per lineal foot based on if it's a block corner or a lot corner for original surveys and that. For resurveys, then it's left to the discretion of the surveyor to use an appropriate monument for the particular situation.
Do we have any East Coast people on here? I know it's a pretty heavy West Coast crowd generally, but any East Coast? Want to talk about what you guys set?
Yeah, I can tell you from Connecticut. So for private subdivisions, for the concrete monuments that are set, those are usually 36 inches in length, whereas the highway right-of-way markers are about 48 inches, I think, with a disc in the top.
Okay. Those are, I mean, so when you're talking about like the 48 inch, are you talking like a full concrete pillar monument set in it, or trying to get a rebar, like 48 inch? I don't know, you do a rebar, but what's kind of thought process there, Sean?
Yeah, actually the standard is to use the 48-inch monument unless there's like ledge, and then you have to drill the ledge and put like a 1-inch solid rebar in with an aluminum cap. So that's kind of how that works. The private sector monuments for the concrete, those generally just have a cross on the top and used for the PT stations. So
Okay.
Nevada's rebar and non-ferrous metal. So basically rebar and aluminum cap type stuff, depending on our stuff. If we setting stuff in center lines, it's brass caps and wells. So we're setting concrete monument and wells and stuff. That's section corners and quarter corners. 16ths are concrete, brass cap and concrete as well. So
for property corners, like in the retracement side, just a rebar and cap, or
Yep.
rebar and pipe, or pipe
Yep.
and cap,
Just rebar and cap. Yep.
rebar and cap.
Yep. California 30-inch pipes, right? Mr. Bush?
California is everything. Everything you guys have talked about so far, they can
Yeah.
go on the ground depending on where you are in California.
Yep.
Depends on where you're at. Brass cast centerline monuments, pipes at the corners, but the pipes on centerline also, spike and washers, the whole 9 yards. Whatever you can think, that's what gets thrown in California.
You know, the interesting thing in Utah is, you know, you guys talk about, you know, section corner monumentation as well as private, but, you know, again, Utah, we've kind of have the unique designation for our county surveyors that are in responsible charge for the section corners themselves, right? And they are the, you know, generally the brass cap and the 48-inch concrete column, and it's appropriate for the setting. You know, if it's in a road, it's a well one, so the water can drain out, you know, or set properly drilled into the ground in an open field, you know, and protected. But it's not something I think about as much for what they're needed, because I'm not setting those. Private corners are generally just a rebar and cap, or a nail and whisk washer. You know, if it's in an asphalt, or we often go with a drilled rivet and concrete. You know, a pretty common practice across all the state of Utah is, in a subdivision, a rear corner is set with a rebar and cap, and then the extension of the property lines are set with a rivet in the curb, and we're not actually setting front property corners. And then retracement of that is, you know, you kind of follow suit for what the original surveyors did as far as location goes. Trevor says in Louisiana, a minimum 18-inch by half-inch rebar.
I would note that you know, coming and moving from Montana to Utah, one of the interesting things I saw here that I haven't seen in too many other places is the propensity to use hand wells with brass caps in them in the centers of all the intersections of the streets. They're excellent idea, especially for streets that are going on section lines and such. But even in streets and subdivisions, they would put a hand well with a ring and lid on it, on all the PCs, PTs, every place in the subdivision that the right of way had a bend on it. Made it really handy for doing surveys, but pretty inconvenient to sit in the middle of some of these busy intersections from a safety standpoint. But I hadn't seen that at all up in Montana as a practice. There we just split curbs and calculated intersections based on curb splits, and then broke down blocks from there. But it's been really handy. Now we've got some of the jurisdictions that are now saying, oh, those monuments are too expensive, and the road, you know, every time they have to do a lift of asphalt, they need to raise the concrete collars on these things, and so maintenance is expensive, and so they're trying to do away with the centerline monuments, which I don't mind if they put them in behind the sidewalk or put them someplace else, but give me 3 or 4 or 5 monuments per subdivision, please. So that I can at least go into a GPS and repeat that subdivision location. But monuments are great. They're good, stable monuments, that's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I've got one county I work in pretty heavily that the county surveyor actually, there's a law that recently passed that puts some of these city or subdivision monuments under the jurisdiction of the county surveyor, and they actually will approve the monument before I stamp it, and they prove it a second time after it's stamped for a location of the, you know, it's kind of a pain in the butt, to be honest, but you know, but then like John said, there's one particular city, the one my office is in, that the city will not approve a subdivision if you're proposing to put a centerline monument in. And so that, I mean, 50 years from now, maybe they've changed the rules, right? But you go to retrace the thought process of boundary retracement. You go to retrace one of these subdivisions that were built during this time that did not have any centerline monumentation in the roads and then the property corners are no longer found, is you have to know that to retrace it. And so knowing, how subdivisions were done 40 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago really plays into that boundary location. There's another surveyor that I retrace quite frequently that ties all their subdivisions to one section corner. I mean, this is the 60s, 70s era subdivisions. And to go retrace one off a subdivision corner, I'm doing I know as soon as I see who did the survey or the subdivision, I know what work has to go into that, right? We talked about that in historical knowledge as well. So
No
great
centerline
discussion.
monuments though. Wow.
What's that?
No centerline monuments. Wow. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Talk about
Yeah,
making more
pretty
work
handy.
for you to do. Yeah, yeah.
They're pretty handy. I mean, you
that's a
pop the
great
lid,
place to
there's an
start.
X on a brass cap, and
Right.
you set up and you cite the next monument. And,
Hey, Wendy.
Yeah. It's a great
Really
place to
easy.
start. Easy place to start to try to
Yeah.
figure out where you're going to. So
As long as you got somebody there to watch your back.
Yeah.
a short
You're
little
bent
story.
over digging out the hole.
Yeah, a short little story here in Orange County is back in the 70s, the county was responsible for setting the well monuments. And they would not set well monuments at every intersection or center line intersection or bend, but the county was responsible for setting the well monuments, what some people call handholds or otherwise. But lo and behold, all the pipes were set, all the center line monuments were set, lot corners are all set. County forgot to go out and finish these caps, because you open up the well monuments now, and a number of places down here in Orange County, no monument in there. There's ties, but no disc down there. So makes it a little bit more interesting.
Well, as long as you've got the ties, I mean, you can always recreate it, right?
Right. Yep.
If those ties get lost, that gets more
Exactly.
challenging.
Yep.
And we could get into the discussion. I mean, with that too, my mind goes to, accuracies of the time. We're tying now with a GPS that's far more accurate than what they were setting those with too. So you kind of have to take that into account too with the retracement. But an interesting thought process there. And there's a number of counties here that don't have county surveyors, and so monuments aren't getting preserved, protected, or reset. And one of the counties in particular has a surveyor that doesn't do his job, and so highway projects and railroad projects come in, knock out those monuments, and that happens to be the same county that the city is in that doesn't do centerline monuments. So on the east side of the city, there's a highway they're just rebuilding right now. Took out all the section corners that everything was tied to, and no centerline monuments.
Ouch.
Makes things fun.
That's a tough place to survey.
It is.
Goodness.
You can have it.
I'll take it. I keep getting paid to do it. So, features of plating law. Although there are many variations of plating laws, some due to climatic or use conditions, and some to political requirements, the 13 essential features of plating laws are as follows. A definition of when a plat must be made. Approval by governing or regulating agencies. So typically that's going to be your planning, health, engineer, tax assessor, city attorney, some sort of inspection, and final approval given by the governing body and various environmental agencies. A title guarantee, performance bonds, a definition who may prepare maps, dedication and street widths, monumentation, setbacks, easements, measurement data required and accuracies needed, recordation, prohibiting sale of lots prior to recording map, and setting monuments at corner positions prior to the sale of lots. And this is an interesting one. I within the same county, I've got cities that I work with that have totally different requirements. And the interesting thing is often the cities don't even know their own requirements. You've got a planner that has no clue, and he'll ask for something on a plat, and you're kind of held hostage a little bit because he won't approve it, but at the same time, I'm like, this is what your laws say, and we're familiar enough with those. So I throw it out to the group discussion again, the plating laws in your area, challenges of getting a subdivision approved or processes for getting subdivision approved in reference to kind of this list we have.
Tell you some of the biggest challenges right now is everything's so kind of fluid. It's like you might have done a map 6 months ago and you go grab that same template and start it, and then resubmit it for another project, and those procedures are no longer the same, right? And so things are changing, procedures are changing pretty fast, and so that's probably one of the biggest challenges right now is just kind of keeping up with some of the jurisdictional changes as they happen.
Especially if you're, like I know Trent, you guys cover such a large area.
Yeah.
Right. So many different jurisdictions, that becomes a difficult challenge to cover and remember all those.
Yep.
Any other surveyors? How's the process look for you guys compared to this list?
I think just speaking recently and doing jurisdictional municipal surveying in California versus the Subdivision Map Act, I think you're right when someone said, planners make those codes for municipalities. I'm like, did they even read what the Subdivision Map Act says? We don't have to do that. But I mean, that's what's in their codes, so you can't, when you're checking these for municipals, you can't ask them to do more than what's in the code, except for when they put a statute as it pertains to and in conjunction with the Subdivision Map Act. So I think, they forget that, all those additional things that planners want and engineers and surveyors want are totally different than what actually should be the minimum basics, these 1 through 13.
Yeah, it's particularly, if it's written in their ordinance is one thing, right? But if it's not, they just think they need it. A good example is I was on a call with a city engineer actually, that used to be in the private sector. I think he should know better, but he's looking at the title report, and the first 2 items of the title report are outstanding taxes, then unwritten mineral rights and unwritten water rights, and then it's special service districts. Those are the first 6 or 7 things on the title report list there. And he's asking the title company to remove them off the list, and he won't sign off the plat because he wants them on the plat, but they're not plattable things. And we can't get them off the title report because the title company is not going to insure against an unwritten mineral, right? But so the final thing I said, show me where on your ordinance it says that I can't record this plat as is. Jerry, you got your hand up.
Yeah, we have a couple of products, a couple of different products in Wisconsin. One's the regular subdivision platting laws that for large scale types of subdivisions. The other is certified survey map, which is for in some places they're called minor subdivisions, but in Wisconsin it's limited to a maximum of 4 parcels. Yeah, that's a really popular one for smaller areas, and especially around municipalities and stuff. The problem they're running into is the specifications for the plat itself is a relatively large sheet of paper traditionally. But on the certified survey map, it's limited to a legal size piece of paper by statute. So on that document, you have to have your 4 parcels at a reasonable scale. Then you have your description, your certificates and all that stuff that goes on there. And what the municipalities are looking at, and this started about 20 years ago, this is a free source of GIS information for them, because the more they can get requested to be put on that map, the more they have quality information that can feed their GIS systems. So we've seen that kind of reaction, and we started to see things being put in there and required by local ordinances as part of the review process. Stuff that has really nothing to do really with the definition of those boundaries and the legal standings of those boundaries. They're just additional things that the municipalities like to see on there, because like I say, they've got this source of accurate mapping information that can feed into their GIS. And moving now towards digital submissions, that makes it just that much easier to get into their systems and that type of thing. So you gotta be really, really careful when we have these legal documents as to what their original intent is and what our role as surveyors are with respect to these documents. We're there, like these chapter says, for creation of new boundaries. And those things stand, for forever, basically. But we're not there to collect, zoning information, topographic information, and all that kind of stuff to go onto that map. There's that gray area in between there.
Thanks, Jerry. I appreciate that insight. And Wisconsin also has essentially a third product, and we've talked about this a few months ago, but it's their kind of the replatting, right? When there's been some major errors over a larger general area, municipality can come in and clean up a bunch of property lines, right? And
that's the assessor's plat, but that's very limited. That can only be ordered by a taxing authority, and only if it can be shown that they're unequitable taxation based on the descriptions and the boundaries as they exist. And so it's generally basically a resurvey, and it vacates all boundaries. Once that gets recorded, it overlays everything else, and all the old boundaries get vacated. Of course, it's a dependent resurvey. And the interesting thing about it is it's not limited to being within the limits of an existing subdivision. It can cross subdivision boundaries. It can include meets and bounds description parcels along with parts of subdivisions. Once it's platted, at that point forward, they're all simultaneously created parcels, regardless of how they originally were. It's like you're wiping the slate clean with their descriptions, but it's still a dependent resurvey. And there was a movement about 20 years ago. People were looking at using those to generate information for GIS systems. So, well, let's just do assessor's plats all over the place. Well, again, that's got a limited definition as to who can order and for what purposes.
Yep. Thanks, Jerry. I really like that, having surveyed in Wisconsin. I do like that. While limited, it's a neat idea to try and correct things. Plotting laws, the number of parcels that may be created or sold prior to the necessity of filing a plat varies within the statutes or ordinances of the states and many local governing bodies. States and or local agencies usually have specific requirements that must be met before any parcel can be subdivided. These agencies usually do not cooperate well in the insisting on a uniformity of regulations. In fact, even adjacent counties may have different requirements. Ran into a situation recently where a surveyor wrote a bunch of descriptions, which essentially created a subdivision of land. There was a road description. You plat it out, it looks like a road. It was a 66-foot width, and it had a little cul-de-sac at the end and an offshoot, and it had 7 lots across it. I have a client that buys one of these thinking he can then go build on it, get a building permit. And the interesting thing is, from a retracement standpoint, there was errors in the description anyways, but the county, it was in unincorporated county land, they actually would not give him a building permit because it was an illegal subdivision. And so that's a challenge is we write descriptions. We are hired to go write a description, but that shouldn't have been the case. I think the surveyor could have done a better job of informing his client that what he was doing, why he can go just file descriptions, essentially creating a legal subdivision would create more problems on the back end for both him as client and future buyers. Planning boards, city councils, county commissions, all those have to be approved usually through those. Within the last 50 years, there's been a marked change in the attitude of people toward land usage. At one time, most people believed that they had a constitutional right to do as they wish with their own land. Now, in many cities, the opposite is true. Land is designated for a particular use by a governing body, and the land may not be used for purposes inconsistent with the desires of the majority without the consent of the governing body. Which is an interesting thing. We could get really political here, and let's not get too deep down that rabbit hole. But it is interesting when we think about, you know, kind of our if you will, don't tread on me thought process that we see, you know, pretty consistent, especially here in the West. But still, we're almost becoming restricted on our land use abilities when we think about subdividing and the uses of that and being able to develop it the way we see fit. There is a great need for a master plan of cities so that streets and roads connect and lots work. But I like that they've put this 12.9 in the book. It's something to think about as we approach subdivisions.
Especially in areas like in California where you're getting more densely populated, or in areas where they want no growth, not to mention low growth. You start to get a lot of restrictions. Then you have other places like in Irvine, here in Orange County, where they want a lot more green space. They want to keep a lot of open space and designate lots, huge lots on subdivisions for stuff like that. So, yep, see a lot of that going on.
Yep. I sat in on a planning commission middle of December where they were doing, now I can't remember the term, but they were essentially this land trade overlay across the city. And there's a few of these in Utah where the city will designate areas that qualify for a higher density development if they dedicated green space or a right of way in a different portion of the city, right? So you've got to buy essentially two pieces of land. This land over here gets dedicated as a forever greenway easement. So in doing so, you qualify then for a certain density bump over here. And it was completely voluntary, but it was really interesting to sit in the city planning commission meeting and hear people's thoughts about, you can't tell me how to develop it, but the city is what they're trying to do is exactly what David said. It's a rural city, farming city, and they, you know, they're the next to get hit by the housing boom. They see it coming. They're on the outskirts, and they want to try and preserve that country feel that they have. Considerations of title. The title to a junior parcel can be no better than the quality of the title of the parent parcel from which the junior parcel was created. Excuse me. In Utah, you are required to file. Again, filing a record survey goes in the county surveyor's office, which is a kind of an opinion of boundary, but you are required to file a record of survey prior to a plat, and that's interpreted different ways through many jurisdictions. But if you're going to go plat something, you need to make sure that it is in the boundaries of the parcel and the rights of those parcels to actually do so. And not encumbrance or encroach on to land that they're not entitled to do so within. Others may have valid claims against a title of property. This title may appear in the form of senior fee titles, easements, or lesser estates or other encumbrances. The quality of title to the lots of a subdivision will be no better than the title of the parent tract. It is imperative that the relationships be determined and investigated before the development starts. Usually such matters are referred to an abstractor, title company, or others who guarantee ownership. At times, this responsibility is accepted by the surveyor. If the surveyor undertakes this responsibility, he or she may assume all liabilities resulting from the actions. So again, let's just kind of get a feel for how everyone else approaches this. If you're doing a subdivision plat, those that do that, you know, are you working with a title company to kind of have a good sense of the rights, if you will, to that land before proceeding? What do your jurisdictions require in that sense?
Some of our local jurisdictions, some require a title report, some don't require a title report with submittals. So it's interesting, but yeah.
I can't think of one entity I work with that doesn't require a title report at this point. Often the title company is just taking my plat description and throwing it in there, so it doesn't really matter. But but I think every entity I work with requires a title report.
I'm not familiar with the term abstractor. Title companies I've done plenty of work with, but an abstractor, I'm not familiar with that one. Is that something that's used in all the rest of the US? Have you guys used abstractors before?
I don't know that there's any, there might be a couple of states that still do abstracts. Back in the day, probably about prior to about 1960, you had title abstract companies, and that's all they did was the title research, generate an abstract, they called it, which was basically a book of containing all of the deeds from patent to the current document, any deed that or action that affected the properties. They would build that abstract. Then you had to take your title abstract to a title attorney who would issue an attorney's opinion on the quality of the title. That was kind of melded together and thrown into an insurance company bucket. And now we have title insurance. And the title insurance company takes on both of those responsibilities, the abstract and the actions of the attorney by insuring the title. And so abstract companies have kind of gone the way of the dodo. But you can still find abstracts occasionally. If you ask the client, they might have one stuck in a safe deposit box or something, and it really helps you in the as far as the research. But now they've got the title companies. Most of them depend on. They're not even doing the abstracting at all. They're depending on prior policies that already insured the property, and they're doing subordination agreements between companies that says, well, okay, we'll insure it from the last transaction till now, or from your policy till now, and then you take the insurance prior to that. And they're just kind of building on each other. And then they've also coupled that with state statutes for the Marketable Record Title Act, it's called. Marketable Record Title Act. It varies a little bit state to state, but it's usually between 30 to 40 and sometimes as high as 50 years. So that the title company is only responsible for the quality of title for the last 40 years. And then so they can research back 40 years plus one document, and that becomes the root of title, as if it's the original patent, original document for the property. And that's all they have to insure is that last 40 years plus one conveyance.
So that gets them away from having to do a
full company get arounds.
So that gets them away from having to do a full blown chain of title
right
on a piece of
and
land.
So yeah, and it also makes it so you get these those preliminary title reports. To me, they're pretty meaningless because all it is says that, yeah, here's the current legal description of the property, here's who the tax assessor says owns it, and yeah, we'll insure it with subject to all these things we own insure, of course. But it's not backed up by an abstract. It doesn't tell you junior, senior. It really doesn't have the weight that it used to have. Now, if they do have a research done, it seems like they just hire some high school kid to go sit in the vault and research it. If it isn't already online, and they just pull some deeds and go back 40 years and say that's good enough. And that doesn't. They miss easements. I find constantly surveying properties where any easement more than 40 years old doesn't show up on the title report, but it's still there in the title record, and the Marketable Title Act doesn't accept those out. It's not like they go away. They're still valid easements, and without them doing the abstracts, they don't pick them up. They don't show them in the policy, and if that's all you're relying on, you don't get to see it either. Unless you stumble on a trip on a manhole or something out there in the field.
Right.
Yeah,
Awesome.
the interesting side of that is John's talking about, this date they only go back so far, but I in the last 10 land title surveys, ALTAs, or subdivisions I've done, I've probably had 3 or 4, I wouldn't say it's quite 50%, where I have found easements that didn't show up on the title report, and I have to go back to the title company, like, hey, did you know about this? One of which was on a prior survey that survey showed up on the title report, but then they didn't show the easement, you know, and it was a right of way that went through the center of our property. I mean, it was a pretty big deal. But at the same time, so they're only going so far doing such a type of search. But the other side to see of that, you know, more recently too, is they will just grab everything. I'm getting 1890s, 1900 easement documents that they reference to land, you know, across such and such landowner covering, and they were blanket easements, and that's part of why they're including it, but covering, you know, this quarter section owned by this guy. Well, that guy was not even part of the parent parcel of what I'm covering, but it was in that quarter section, and I'm plotting out 4 or 5, you know, usually they're telegraph easements too. You know, the facilities aren't even in anymore, but they were telegraph easements, and I've got to go back with the client and go through every single one of those and prove to the title company they're not in there, or they're not plottable, or they're not applicable, and try and get those off the title report or cleared so we can get a subdivision recorded. But it's the other side of it. We'll just take everything. If it's ever been looked at across that parcel or near that parcel, we're just going to include it, take our liability out, and good luck, everybody.
Yeah, it's a matter of risk analysis, and like you say, you know, that easement has gone away decades ago, but they're still carrying it on their insurance policies as exceptions, and it makes a mess out of everything. But it's from them. It's just a matter of risk, and if you're willing to convince them that this easement does not exist, well, okay, fine, they'll insure it, but because it's an ALTA survey, you get the liability for it, not them. They've taken exception to your survey on their policy. So
yes,
you know, that's their out.
Yep. So title guarantee that goes into a lot of what we're talking about. Again, that guarantee that they have the rights to then do what they're going to do with that piece of property. 1212 boundary survey. In former years, the location of the boundary was the only place a surveyor incurred liability for errors. An interior monument set, even though not in its correct position, may, after it is used, become correct. In recent years, the tendency has been for a developer to produce both house and lot, with delayed staking. The surveyor sets temporary interior stakes for the house location, and if these are wrong, problems ensue. Boundary monuments of a subdivision along the line adjacent to another owner do not always have the dignity of no error of position. Subdividing land does not automatically erase the rights of the adjoiner. If part of the adjoiner's land is taken, the adjoiner may assert any right up to and until time imposed by the statute of limitations. In the past, errors may have occurred along subdivision boundaries with resultant gaps or overlaps. Within a platted subdivision wherein one line represents the boundary between adjacent lots, it is not possible to have gaps or overlaps, but along the exterior boundaries, even though the adjoining property is shown as abutting and only one line is drawn. The new subdivision plat does not change the former status of the adjoiner's rights. In resurvey or retracement procedures, lots adjoining boundary lines of the parent tract represent a great hazard to the surveyor and possibly could be a fruitful area for future liability. What that's telling us is interior to that. They're simultaneously created, right? And there's a graphic map that represents those. And it's impossible then to create gaps or overlaps within a subdivision, right? All those lines are there and there's one lines, but the liability of that exterior, if there's any issues not resolved prior to platting, junior and senior rights, unwritten rights, or anything like that, is still a risky area for surveyors in both boundary retracement or in the subdivision platting. We've kind of talked about this, but how many states require, and again, I know the survey requirements are different state to state, but how many states require some sort of recorded survey or filed survey prior to platting?
In Clark County, we don't.
But that's not required in Wisconsin either, although you do have to show the perimeter survey information, but that's part of the subdivision plat.
essentially that plat is a survey and a subdivision then, because you are resolving that exterior boundary. Are they looking at it in
Yes,
that sense?
yes, yeah, you're supposed to. I mean, you can't subdivide something that you don't know where its boundaries are. So yeah, you're doing an exterior survey to establish the parent parcel and then subdividing that parent parcel into the smaller pieces. Going back to what you were saying before about that area of concern along the exterior, if the lots coincide with the parent parcel on the boundary along there, they inherit the same relationship that the parent had with the surrounding adjoiners and that type of thing. So if the parent was junior to the adjoining parcel and a subdivision plat and a subdivision lot shares that boundary, then that lot becomes junior to the adjoiner next door.
Thanks, Jerry. Absolutely. Any discussion on that? Questions on exterior boundaries and retracing subdivisions?
Well, and you got to remember that if that does happen, I always get students on this with this kind of question. If there is in fact, say, an overlap onto a senior boundary with that exterior lot, say there's a foot, you cannot prorate that foot against any other lots in that block because they don't touch or concern that boundary. That's only restricted to that particular lot. It's not like the found monuments and that type of thing where you're prorating between found monuments.
Okay. So if there's four, I mean, if there was 5 boundaries, 5 lots that touched our exterior boundary, right? But the one deed in the middle of those 5 had some sort of error in there, but it had senior rights, then the 2 or 3 of our lots that touched that one, but lots on either side then would remain untouched.
You're just like a student, you're overcomplicating the hell out of it.
Okay. I am a student,
if you take a row of of lots that go from one side of the subdivision to the other side of the subdivision, okay, so that they share the parent boundaries on both sides. And on one side, it overlaps onto a senior owner by that 1 foot, then you can't take that 1 foot and prorate it back through all those other lots. It only affects that one singular lot. Okay. So that's what I'm getting at there. By the same token, if there's a gap that's created, then it's again the same relationship that the parent would have with the adjoiner that lot inherits. Okay. So you gotta be careful. You're right. That is a problem area for sure. But that's again why we do the exterior survey first to establish the parent parcel and then subdivide that parent parcel. So it's a resurvey of the exterior and a new survey of the interior. So they work hand in hand.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that. That helps. Requirements for corner monumentation. All platting laws require completed and adequate monumentation. Usually there's some sort of time requirement of when those need to be set with recording. And that gets tricky. I mean, as a surveyor that works for an engineering firm as well, and I'm often doing the construction staking, and like the book said, a lot of these developers now are doing both the subdivision and the road development and building the houses. It's an interesting thing for me that I try and balance with my professional liability is when to set those corners. I used to just go set them all, and then the development company comes in and tears them all out as they build homes, and then I got to go back and set them, and they don't want to pay me to do it twice, and there's a fight there, of course. But now I sent temporary markers so that they can then build their homes. I'm often staking those homes too, which is an added business bonus, but takes some of that liability of not setting them. But it depends on the developer and the construction company. But that is an interesting challenge when we set the proper monumentation and make sure it's there at the right time to meet my professional obligations, along with just the needs of the site and development. density of monuments. We talked about, and John talked about there, when he first moved to Utah, and there's a lot of cities that require a centerline monument, if you will, on every PC, PT, intersection, tangent. There's subdivisions have 40 monuments and 35 lots. And there's some cities that like we said, don't require any, and then some that just leave it up to the interpretation of the surveyor, which is an interesting discussion. But the distance between control monuments, usually specified by law, should be determined by accuracy considerations and individual needs. I approach it on those cities that don't have any given requirement. I kind of think about it as, can I set up a gun on one and backside the other and get to my lot in any given location? If that's what I needed to do. Measurement errors are a function of distance and angle, although not direct relationship, and it follows that the closer together and more densely located the monuments are, the less uncertainty will exist in relocating land parcels. Any monumentation that's created should address 7 important elements: size and composition, identification of the surveyor setting the monument, maximum distance between the monuments, setting all monuments prior to sale of the land. I think that's probably the most critical one, is helping people know where their boundaries are when they buy it. Responsibilities of the developer, realtor, and surveyor, use of reference monuments, and methodology used to create the corner areas. Are there any special laws or considerations in your guys' area when you are setting subdivision monuments? Pretty straightforward, all property corners. Okay. Use of coordinates in subdivisions. State plane coordinates, when used properly, are the modern means of ensuring certainty of corner restoration in the event of monument destruction. Again, we talk about the rules of construction. Area and coordinates are the last 2 of that rule. There are, to my dismay, still a couple of cities that I work within that require on their plat, by ordinance, coordinates on all exterior property corners and section monuments or controlling monuments. And I fight them every single time on that, because it's dangerous. It is. I did a construction survey years ago, it was designed by an engineering company that did not have surveyors. They provided coordinates and everything, control from their contracted surveyor, and then I was hired by the construction company to go do it. And I could not hit any of their monuments, and there was a ground to grid factor in there. And I called to confirm with the surveyor who said it, to say, okay, are these grid coordinates or ground coordinates, scale factor, anything you have? And he swore up and down that they were ground coordinates and they were correct. And I undoubtedly knew they were not ground coordinates because I could not tie in to any 2 of those at all, which made for a very interesting construction site. We were about a foot short on about a 1.5 mile road once we got through it because of their error. And the challenge was it was super flat, except for the last 400 feet, which had a 12% slope on it. So not only were horizontally off, we were very vertically off, and nothing fit. And so coordinates are just a bad idea. Let's just say that. Jerry, go ahead.
I'll play a little bit of devil's advocate here with respect to that, just to get some conversation going here. In Wisconsin, we're ahead of the curve on everything. We've had low distortion coordinate systems for decades, county coordinates. So when things are done here, usually the coordinate system, they're done in a low distortion coordinate system. We don't use state plane here. We don't use UTM. The only people who use UTM is Department of Natural Resources. That's a variation of UTM. But how is somebody who doesn't know what the hell they're doing providing coordinates any less reliable than somebody who doesn't know what the hell he's doing providing bearings and distances. You know, it's another set of measurements, and a person that doesn't understand coordinates isn't gonna understand bearings and distances either. So it's one of these things where the technology is becoming so much easier for us to be able to collect information that we're getting more and more people don't know what the hell they're doing, that are collecting the information and that type of thing. So I still think 50% of the core of the surveyors in the state of Wisconsin don't know how to use coordinates correctly because they don't know how to document what they're doing. The important thing about coordinates is what datum, what adjustment are you on? What are you tying to? What units are you using? There's a whole lot of stuff, metadata, that has to go with coordinates. Just like there has to be metadata that goes with bearings and distances. What's your direction reference? This business about are they ground coordinates or grid coordinates? Come on. Ground and grid are the same thing with the load distortion system, but if you don't have a load distortion system, then you shouldn't be working in ground coordinates. You should be working in grid coordinates because that's a formal, rigorously defined coordinate system. Ground coordinates are not. So I mean, there's a lot more to this than just whether coordinates are a good thing or not. In Wisconsin, in our states, in our subdivision regulations, it says specifically that you have to use if you're going to use coordinates, that one, they have to be a recognized coordinate system, either our county coordinates or state plans. So that have to be rigorously defined. And two, that the coordinates will be inferior to all other information shown on the plat if they conflict, which is it's the same thing that common law says, but we got it right in statute. It says if it conflicts, it's inferior to all the other information that's on there and that type of thing. So it's an educational type of thing. You know, I don't think coordinates are any worse than bearings and distances if they're used correctly.
Are you even so the last 10 plus years with LDPs, you're still seeing issues with people putting the right stuff on plats and everything?
Hey, I did a presentation on coordinate systems at the state conference about 5-6 years ago. And I talked about, I was talking about the shifts between the datum adjustments and how much positions changed and that type of thing. And the guy came up to me afterwards, he said he's from Illinois, and he had just landed a contract with one of the counties in the state of Wisconsin to remonument a whole bunch of PLSS corners. And he said, the only thing he doesn't understand is what the hell these county coordinates are supposed to be putting on all these things.
Oh my goodness.
So we had a guy to bid on and won a contract for doing remonumentation for a county and didn't know jack shit. So
You're good.
Didn't know jack about the coordinate systems. But you know what? You can probably put that into GPS. Well, yeah, all of our coordinate systems are canned in all the software. It's in GIS software. It's in the data collectors, etc., where you can just call up the coordinate systems. But the thing that confuses the hell out of people is we got two sets of load distortion coordinate systems. We got the original county systems and we got the new one. So, but that's a whole nother issue and that type of thing. So there are people that, if they haven't been using them on a routine basis, don't necessarily understand the county coordinate systems. And I think we're going to see this happening. There's going to be that transitional period, I think, nationally, when we start to go with the new data readjustment and the load distortion systems that a lot of counties or a lot of the states are trying to move to, people getting used to that.
Yep.
We used to have on the DOT maps years and years ago, they had conversion factors and grid factors, not for distances, but for points. And you had to multiply a coordinate by a grid factor to go from ground coordinates to grid coordinates, which is confusing as hell. But that's the way the DOT did things, because that's the way the DOT did things. You know,
Yeah,
an
yeah.
800-pound gorilla, you know.
Mm.
So
Yeah, I was just curious because knowing, the 2022 datum when that does come about, I was, for me, I'm thinking it's going to help out and clear up some of these issues. But here you are in Wisconsin 10 years later, and there's still issues.
There are issues. No matter what you go to,
Yeah.
there's always going to be some sort of issues.
Yep.
One of the biggest things that we have with the GIS people is converting between geodetic coordinates and grid coordinates. And they'll routinely round latitude and longitude to the nearest 10th or 100th of a second.
Right.
Well, you're losing all your accuracy because a second on the ground at our latitude and longitude is about 100 feet.
Right.
So you got to go out 5 decimal places on latitude and longitude. They don't like doing that. So they round off all the stuff. And then they wonder why when they take and they convert the stuff back into feet to the nearest 100th of a foot, nothing matches.
It is a concern because
you get me started on this stuff, and I can be going all night.
Well, it's interesting because if you're on any of the social media or surveyors, Facebook or Instagram or anything like that, or online, they deprecated the U.S. survey foot, right? Which really, at the end of the day, doesn't mean anything because you can still use it. But you've got half these surveyors out there thinking the world is ending because they don't understand what that means. Just because it's not the preferred method anymore, it doesn't mean it can't be used. And your survey you started on December 31st is no longer valid January 1st because the foot doesn't exist. It's an interesting discussion of understanding and education, like you said.
Yeah, well, for stuff like an elevation or a lot boundary, bearings, distances around a lot, it doesn't matter which conversion factor you use. Where it does make a difference is if you are using state plane coordinates, because then your numbers are so huge, because the difference between the two is 1 in 500,000. And if you got coordinates in terms of millions, which we have for our east coordinates and our state plane, yeah, it makes a difference. But in our low distortion systems that are county-based, they're small enough where it really doesn't matter which conversion factor you use, international foot or survey foot. It's small enough that it kind of goes away as an issue, as a problem. So it's only the bigger things that really matter. So these people are running around, screaming the sky is falling. And this has nothing to do with Washington at this point, because I can get started on that too. But it really is a non-issue.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I just got an email from a client back in DC, and we're doing some environmental stuff on the Air Force Base here. And they provided their coordinates, gave us the coordinate system it was in. It was a UTM zone. They're working in meters, and so we have set all our stuff to work in their system, and did some topography 2 weeks ago, sent them that information, and they emailed back saying they can't get it to fit their data, and asking me what system we're in. And the only thing I say, well, we're in the exact system that you gave us, and the exact system we've given you everything else in. We haven't changed our system. We understand what we're measuring, and we haven't ever changed it. So I don't know why it doesn't fit, and we're going to work with them to do it. But there is, even in the GIS world, it's a click of a button. We're in UTM, so I'm going to click UTM. I'm in Wisconsin South Zone, or I'm in Dane County zone, and so I'm just going to click that button, and there's no regard for all that metadata you're talking about that goes along with that.
Yeah, but there's a certain, the problem we get into is we're trusting too much on the software to make those decisions for us. One of the reasons we had to redefine our coordinate systems. Our coordinate systems worked fine, but the way they were originally defined for the counties was they weren't fit at a grid system at the ground level fit to the ellipsoid. What they did is they analyzed each county and determined what the median elevation was and the geoid height. And then they raised the ellipsoid. They increased the semi-major, semi-minor axis of the ellipsoid to bring it up to ground level and then fit the grid at that point. And it worked fine. But when you go into software like a GIS package, When it sees different semi-major and semi-minor axis, it's no longer GRS 80 as far as it knows. It's a different ellipsoid. So when it tries to go between UTM and a county coordinate systems, instead of going through a rigorous conversion, it does a transformation. And you lose accuracy in there because it doesn't know that there is a rigorous connection between those. So that's why we had to go back and redefine the way our coordinate systems were defined to make them compatible with the, we had to do our coordinate systems to make them compatible with the software. We couldn't make the software compatible with our coordinate systems. And that drives me up a wall when we have to readapt what we do to software instead of the other way around. That has always been one of my pet peeves with respect to software. But you didn't know that was happening. It was going on in the background. So all of a sudden, if things don't fit, you don't know why. You assume the data's bad.
Thanks for sharing that. I didn't know that either. I mean, I was familiar with the county systems, but I didn't know that. Though in my one county, I will say we'll end the discussion here and move on to finish this chapter as we're about out of time here. But in my one county, I've got more elevation change than the whole state of Wisconsin combined. So we have a different challenge when we look at low distortion systems and the number of systems that Utah is going to have. It will be really interesting to see how that transition happens and how surveyors and mappers understand that and move forward. They talk about some challenges and disadvantages with these systems. We've kind of talked at length about coordinates, and there's definitely some opinions on that, which is great. I love it. But just kind of moving on here. Certifications of surveys. This is huge. We've talked about certifying. Well, we've talked a lot about narratives as we've talked about this book and describing what we are doing and why we've done it, right? How we've landed on that. There is another side of surveys that a lot of states have requirements. Utah has a requirement for it, where we actually then certify the survey, right? Not only are we explaining how and what we did, but we are stamping, and there's some language that we use in Utah that we certify too that we've done the work, we've had responsible charge, we're comfortable with it, and we take responsibility for what we did. This is the part that often scares the surveyors, the new surveyors, but this is a huge part. Again, in Utah, that survey being filed prior to recording a plat, again, that's an opinion, a certified opinion, a professional opinion, and the plat goes separately then to the recorder's office. But do you guys have, and I have a certification that we put on our plats, and the certification reads that it's been subdivided pursuant to the statutory regulations of the state for subdivisions. But do you guys have a survey certification? Excuse me, a survey certification and or a subdivision certification, or both, that you guys put on your plats?
We do.
Same thing, two different certifications kind of combined into one?
Nevada has them all, just depending on what type of map you're filing. So,
okay. Dedications. This is one, Trent, if you ever got some expert on dedications on a Mentoring Mondays, this is one that I am starting to understand a little bit more the nuances of, and cities have different dedications they require, but there's been a lot of discussion. I wish John didn't have to jump off here. Utah's got, they call it the LUDMA Act, the Land Use Act, and certain attorneys interpret that a plat is not a conveying document, so they require you to file easements before the plat and show them on the plat with the recording information. Some cities will let you dedicate open space or preserve ownership of open space to an owner versus the developer that owns the overall land, and different things like that. But that's all in dedications and dedicating the streets and easements and what can and can't be dedicated. That's really going to be held by your local jurisdiction. But I would love to get an attorney or someone who's expert in dedications. I've got, it's something that it's evolving in Utah. quite a bit, and I'm trying to keep up with that evolution and learn it. But there is some sort of dedication. The roads go to the public or to the city, right? And then easements go to those uses and what is happening with those dedications.
Those
Setback.
dedications are standard on all of our track maps.
Yeah.
Everything that happens, you know, what the street is, you know, who's reserved for, who they're going to, all the lots, everything is all talked about in the dedication. That's a standard thing that we've had in California now for, as far as I know, quite a while.
Do you have a codified dedication that gets used, or is that jurisdictional?
Jurisdictional.
The crazy part with California, though, is there has to be an acceptance. You can say dedicated all over the map all day long you want, but if it was never accepted,
right,
that's the difference. So,
So by acceptance, like the city, because like in Utah, I should pull one up, but it'll take me too long to dial into my network. In Utah, you have, you know, we, the undersigned, here subdivide and split into lots and streets, you know, the Trent Williams subdivision, and hereby dedicate all public roads, you know, here. And then there's usually like Weber County that I work in, they have a really great list, right? So parks to this, the roads to this, public utility easements for the use of public utilities. One thing that we're doing more and more of as we get into the harder developer areas or closer to the lake as we go out west is the water table's higher. So we have more subdivisions that have engineered yard drains. So then we do a dedication of yard drain easements to the specific lot owners, right? So that easement, then if that crosses 4 lots, that yard drain gets dedicated to those 4 owners, that it can't be interfered with. You know, the last lot on the line can't block the 3 above him, type of deal. But usually we just do a pick and choose out of this list. But very few cities have some sort of, this is what we want you to say. There's one city that has holds and warrants and holds harmless the city against all claims. You know, basically they hold themselves outside of the subdivision process, which is interesting because they are the approving authority, but then they take no responsibility for approving it because that language is in their dedication. So it's interesting. That's a neat discussion there for sure. Setbacks. Again, was it Jerry that you were saying about? I think it was Jerry or John was talking about the subdivision. Maybe David, you said it, but the subdivision plat from a survey standpoint is a division of land into individual lots, right? The property itself, and then there are, and often required on plats, a lot of zoning information. We have jurisdictions that want us to actually graphically plot setbacks. I've got a jurisdiction that refuses to let you put setbacks because what if they change the zone through there, which is a little silly because if you platted it at like a 100-foot lot width and you change the zone to 150-foot lot width or a 50-foot lot width, all of a sudden you make those zones, those parcels unusable. But they want setbacks or don't want setbacks, and what does that look like? Recording, then it gets recorded, right? So in Utah, it gets submitted to the city once approved by the planning commission or city council or whatever the process might be. You generally have then the city departments, engineering, planning. Some require the health department, county surveyor to sign it, even if it's a survey or a county jurisdiction, and then it gets recorded at the county. And that's what officially then creates those parcels of land, those lots. And again, that's a simultaneous creation. Each of those lots within the subdivision have equal rights among everyone else, save the discussion we had about junior and senior rights along the exterior boundaries that may exist. Pre-surveys without recording, examination by authority, and then summary. This chapter is an abbreviated and limited discussion. We were to pull every jurisdiction. We've kind of talked about this. They're all different, have different requirements. So definitely consult the local authorities. The main lesson the student and surveyor should take from this chapter is that the creation of modern subdivisions is highly regulated, should not be totally versed in the specific local requirements required by local governmental bodies, could be a major source of problems for the surveyor who wishes to work in this area. This means keeping up to date with all the changes and the most current rules and regulations.
By the hour. Changes by the hour.
Yes, yes. Any questions, concerns about this chapter? Anything we didn't cover or didn't leave clear enough for you guys?
That was a
Sounded
good.
great.
Yeah. It's difficult, like you say, just because of so much is jurisdictionally driven, right? So it's hard to have kind of a full chapter and a full conversation on it when it's all driven by planning and zoning and, different state laws and county laws and stuff. So it's definitely not an easy discussion to have.
But, Trent, I think to augment that, it is, the
Yeah.
concepts are
Right.
fairly uniform.
Yeah.
In that it's multi-jurisdictional and we're not a public land state, but a lot of what that chapter read to me was that you just have to know your laws and follow them, but these are the basic principles.
Yeah, especially when it comes to the monumentation and stuff like that. I mean, that's
Yeah.
going to be pretty much standard across. Yeah. Yep. The next chapter 13, which I'm loading up part 2 of chapter 11 now. That's where I think we kind of got lost, but chapter 13, unwritten transfers of land ownership. And then very, very beginning of it says, this chapter is not intended to be a source of legal advice for the surveyor.
Yep.
Big old note right on the top. So
This is one definitely we need some of our more involved or heavy hitters to have discussion in here, because this is another one that gets, we can get into the weeds if we're not careful. There's a lot of, when it's unwritten here, is how do you handle that and talk about it, and where do you draw the line chasing it? So this will be a good chapter in 2 weeks.
Next week, the 25th.
Next week. Yes, next week. Yes.
Yeah, we'll go back to the 4th. So it'll be the 4th Wednesday next week. So we'll be back to back.
That works.
Awesome.
Well, thanks everybody. That went really well for not being prepared for the chapter. So thanks everybody. I appreciate it.
No worries. We got through it. It's good.
Yeah.
Awesome, everybody. Have a good night.
See ya.
Good.
All
All right.
right.
Thank you very much. Good night.
Bye, guys.